Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome once again back to the Siege of Vraks. But briefly before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who picked up one of the limited edition mousepads I announced in the last video. They were torn away in just a couple of hours, which is pretty damn cool in my opinion, and well, more than I'd expected. A little overwhelming, frankly, but enough self-aggrandizement, let us move on with the lore video. So today we will be looking at what happened on the ground whilst the whole kerfuffle in space was occurring. Many of you may have already wondered what exactly the Death Corps was up to whilst everybody was shooting lasers at one another up above. And so, of course, we have to go back in time a bit, once again, to before the Chaos Fleet was even called. Until right after the breakthrough of the second defensive line, which had finally been broken through, leading to the eventual, if hard-fought and grindy success, of the Great Push. However, as we know, the Great Push only succeeded after great sacrifice and considerable costs, which quite simply left the Death Corps too bruised, too battered, too wounded, and too exhausted to carry out the necessary rapid armoured thrust to break through the third defensive line. And so, presented with no easy way of cracking the final obstacle before them, the Death Corps of Krieg had to once again stop, collect themselves, and begin fortifying their positions yet again. Bunkers would have to be sited, trenches would have to be dug, artillery emplacements created and planned, the entire logistical system would have to be recreated essentially from the ground up, since now, of course, all of the various logistical elements would now have to move over what was once the rear portions of the second defensive line, fully and completely exposed to Vraksian artillery. And speaking of the rebels' heavy guns, their presence also meant that new logistical bunkers would have to be created. Reinforced dugouts to store artillery, dugouts to store men, dugouts for the command staffs, etc, etc, etc. The 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army would have to create 150 kilometers of new positions before they could consider themselves back and fully ready to carry out further offensive operations. Though, to be fair, the time required to construct these new positions would have to have been spent anyways, to bring down fresh reinforcements, supplies, and to restock the at this point severely depleted ammunition bunkers. On the bright side, this was the third and final Vraksian defensive line. Once it was finally cracked, all that would stand between the Death Corps of Krieg and final victory was the Vraksian citadel itself, whilst still a formidable defensive work was nothing compared to the lines that had already been broken. And so when that was finally surrounded, the war should be over rather quickly. On the downside, however, the third and final line, often referred to as the Red Line, was also by far the most heavily fortified, reinforced, and defended of all the Vraksian lines. It might even be correct to say that it was not so much a single defensive line as it was one continuous gargantuan defensive position in and of itself. Continuous lines of bunkers, permacrete trenches, fortifications, flak towers, artillery bunkers, mortar pits, reinforcement dugouts, underground reinforced command bunkers, heavy weapons batteries, etc, etc. And of course, the orbital defense batteries themselves. These monstrously massive fortifications were designed to house the huge laser defense batteries intended to shoot down spaceships in low orbit, and these batteries could also be directed towards ground targets, albeit with considerably less in the way of efficiency, but these were laser batteries designed, once again, to shoot down spacecraft. Even if they were not at their peak, they would still be quite devastating. And of course, there is also the armoured casemates and the fortifications they were housed in themselves. The simple fact was that these batteries were essentially the lifeline of the Vraksian defenders. If they were captured or destroyed, then their resistance would be measured at best in days and quite possibly in hours, as the Imperium would then be able to exert full void superiority above the planet, unleashing all manners of attack craft and precision strike orbital bombardments without any fear of being engaged from the surface. Of course, the Vraksian defenders were not aware of the fact that the Imperial Navy had nowhere near enough firepower in system to make good on that particular threat, at least not immediately, but there was of course no reason why they couldn't simply bring in some more ships if this were to happen. Remember, one of the original plans was quite literally to attack and knock out these very batteries, after which a direct strike upon the citadel would become feasible. Thusly, recognizing just how vulnerable they would be without these batteries, they had been reinforced and strengthened over virtually the entirety of Vraks's existence, and the new administration was no exception to that rule. And so, even though the Death Korps was finally entrenched outside of the last hindrance to final victory, they were still quite a distance away, and most in Lord Commander Julka's command staff had long since given up any realistic hope of a quick victory. Whilst the great push was still underway, there was still a sliver of hope, a glimmer of potential that maybe, just maybe, enough strength could still be husbanded for a quick breakthrough, but now that the positions would have to be recreated, that hope was well and truly quashed. The Lord Commander himself had long since made peace with this idea, thinking that as long as he could guarantee eventual victory, his overall military reputation would not suffer overmuch. And even if it did look set to take a hit, there would always plenty of scapegoats to choose from. However, there was still the question of optics. The Death Korps of Krieg could, potentially at this point, essentially just sit back and reduce the enemy's positions one by one by one. It would be the safest option, and it would also be the original plan. But that plan had been estimated to take something along the lines of 5 to 6 years. And now the Death Korps had, at the very best, 3. Basic mathematics suggests that this plan, whilst still viable, might be construed as somewhat passive by the higher-ups in the Imperial High Command. There was even the possibility that, unjust as it may sound, that the Lord Commander himself might bear some of the responsibility for this apparent tardiness and unwillingness to prosecute the campaign to the fullest. Worst case scenario, the more unreasonable members of Skara's High Command may even place part of the blame for the delay upon the Lord Commander himself. No, such unjust judgment could not be allowed to come to pass. The Death Korps would be granted a period of rest and relaxation to fully reconstitute themselves after the Great Offensive, but the moment the Death Korps was ready for limited offensive operations once again, they would begin. And naturally, this didn't really have anything to do with meeting the deadline. That time had already well and truly passed, but it could conceivably reduce the amount of time with which said deadline had been missed from 4 to 5 years to maybe only 1 or 3. And the best part, of course, was that all of this could be achieved merely with the expenditure of a few million more lives. A bargain, if you were to ask the Lord Commander. As for the commanders on the front line, literal light years away from the Lord Commander's headquarters on Thracia Primaris, they were of a somewhat less cheery disposition. So far in the war, well over 4 million Death Korps guardsmen had made the ultimate sacrifice in the name of the Emperor, and well in excess of 20 million had become heavily wounded. It was only due to the exceptional skill and determination of the Death Korps' quartermasters that the death toll had been kept so relatively low. as after each major battle, the Death Corps' quartermasters and their staffs would venture out into no man's land to rescue those that could be rescued and to salvage what equipment could be salvaged. After every offensive, small and large, they would venture out into no man's land and drag back hundreds, if not thousands, of guardsmen, whilst engaging in running skirmishes with Vraksian patrols. For all their morbid reputation, the quartermasters of Krieg were some of the bravest and truest servants of the God Emperor, saving millions of lives from unnecessary slaughter so that they may have yet another chance to fight and die for their God Emperor. But despite the heroic efforts of the Death Corps' quartermasters, deaths were still very much so unavoidable, and many more were maimed to the point where they were no longer worthy as frontline personnel. Of course, the home planet of Krieg was continuously resupplying the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army with fresh recruits, and in many cases, entire regiments worth of replacements. But the deadline was starting to get uncomfortably close, and as of yet no one really knew what precisely would happen once the 12 years were up. Lord Commander Julka and Imperial Guard High Command must have considered the implications of this, but they never made any real efforts to find out precisely what would happen. Would they be able to acquire some form of extension? Would they be able to continue the offensive, or would breaching the deadline simply mean outright defeat? It was all speculation, and it was, furthermore, speculation that Lord Commander Julka was not overly fond of entertaining, since the implications could, in many cases, be rather worrisome. But that, as the commanders on the ground were wont to say, was a battlefield that would have to be crossed later. For now, there were plenty of more immediate and pressing concerns to take into consideration. The Lord Commander demanded continuous offensive actions be taken by any regiment that considered itself to be in a state to do so, and at least for the moment, that determination and where they would strike was left up to the Death Corps' commanders, so there was a rare chance to prioritize. By far the most immediate was what was known by the Death Corps of Krieg Guardsmen as Mortuary Ridge. Located in Sector 558470, directly opposite the 468th Regiment of the 46th Line Corps, Mortuary Ridge was, as the name implies, a series of rises in the terrain that overlooked a deep valley. A valley in which the 468th Regiment was currently trying to entrench themselves as best they could. It was, however, no position for any lengthy stay. If the Death Corps was to remain in this position, they would be under constant plunging fire from their enemies up on the ridge, and their casualties would be, frankly, unsustainable, even by Death Corps standards. This left the commanders of the 468th Regiment with only two choices. The first was to pull back to a defensive position outside of the valley, which meant that they would leave the entirety of the valley as a future no man's land that would have to be crossed eventually by some poor buggers, or they would have to receive permission by the 46th Line Corps' headquarters to carry out an offensive upon Mortuary Ridge, which would necessitate the deployment of further Imperial Guard regiments to their right and left, to ensure that the Vraksians would not be able to simply force reinforcements into the gap until the 468th bled out. Luckily, it was part of the 46th Line Corps, relatively new arrivals to the Vraksian theatre, so they should be able to sustain one more small offensive. And frankly, the 46th Line Corps was in a unique position to fulfill the Lord Commander's instructions, a position that the other Line Corps were, by and large, simply not in, and whilst still rather battered themselves, they had no right to refuse. Luckily, they could still limit the offensive operations scale, and taking into consideration the state of the various regiments and the Line Corps as a whole, it probably should be a limited one. And it truly would be a small one, with very limited objectives. The 468th was not even to breach or capture the enemy's positions. All it was supposed to do was to gain the top of the ridge in front of it, and then hunker down, essentially inserting the regiment into the enemy's defensive positions, and then holding on for dear life. These limited goals would be achieved by a primary push of 5 companies, with another 2 in reserve and 2 on the flank. Additionally, neighbouring regiments would be carrying out their own small-scale offensives to draw reinforcements away from the sector in which the 468th was attacking. Additionally, the 462nd was to receive the aid of the 72nd Armoured Company, which sounds a lot grander than it really was. Having partaken in some of the heaviest fighting so far, the 72nd had been reduced to something along the lines of 20% strength. And hell, the 468th wasn't looking all that much better. Several of the companies that would take part in the attack were down to 70 or even close to 50% strength. This could not turn into a contest of endurance, for whilst the Death Corps of Krieg were normally experts in that kind of warfare, their current strength simply would not allow it. They would have to get into the enemy's positions quickly and then hunker down as best they could. And the bad news did not end there. The regiment was also severely lacking in heavy artillery with which to support the attack. After a lot of scrounging, they came up with 360 pieces of various quality, but still deemed operationally sufficient. And ammunition, sadly, was even scarcer. The Great Push had eaten up an absolutely ludicrous quantity of artillery ammunition, and the need to support the Great Push as it tried and mostly failed to break through the second defensive line had devoured even more of the Corps' ammunition reserves. They were now down to the dregs of the dregs of the reserves. Not a great position when facing an heavily entrenched enemy. With all this in mind, it was most definitively time for a little bit of improvisation, usually considered a particularly foul and dirty word by Death Corps officers. This was not the time to stand on principle, sadly. Thusly, the first attack, which needed to be successful, would be supported by what remained of the 72nd Company directly. The armoured elements would not be held in reserve, instead they would be trundling up to the front line alongside the infantry. This would almost assuredly lead to heavy losses amongst the tank crews, especially from the heavy guns of Fort C-585, which was one of the primary strong points atop Mortuary Ridge. Especially as there simply was not enough heavy artillery ammunition to continue to suppress the fort whilst the regiments attacked. And that wasn't the end of the bad news once again, because there was so little in the way of ammunition that most of it would be used up by the preliminary bombardment, and what remained would all be kept in reserve to halt a potential enemy counterattack should the companies actually manage to gain a foothold. That meant that there would be no box barrage to prevent enemy reinforcements from streaming into the battlefield. Instead, that particular job fell upon the heavy weapons crews. They would quite literally be firing their heavy bolters and stubbers in high arcs to try and land plunging fire upon the enemy's rear positions. Heavy artillery it most definitively was not, but hey, it was better than nothing. The main assault would consist of the 31st, the 33rd, the 53rd, the 54th, and 68th Infantry Companies. The 31st was to clear the enemy's front line of trenches, while the 54th was to take on Fort C-585 and hopefully capture it, or at the very least keep it so busy that it couldn't screw over the other companies by directing its heavy weapons batteries into their flanks. The 54th would also be supported by most of the 72nd Armoured Company, including 2 ancient but still effective Macarius heavy tanks. The Macariuses are odd vehicles within the Imperial Guard armory, essentially baby Baneblades. They're far bigger and more heavily armed and armoured than a Leman Russ, but doesn't possess anywhere near the sheer destructive firepower of something like a Baneblade. Generally speaking, most Imperial Guard regiments these days prefer the smaller, more manoeuvrable and more flexible Leman Russ to the massive Macarius, but for formations like the Death Corps of Krieg, in which subtlety and manoeuvrability is not always the most important features, the big old Macarius heavy tanks can often find a home and fulfill very specialised roles that are often quite useful to siege regiments. Being able to lug around 2 Leman Russ battle cannons in a single turret, for example, makes it able to pop permacrete fortifications quite easily and with frightening regularity. Granted, the big old lug chugs Promethium like virtually nothing else short of a super heavy tank, and it does often have some teensy-weensy problems navigating terrain that has already been dug up by heavy artillery shelling, but still, even if it does get stuck, well, now it's essentially just a massive, fat, near-impenetrable pillbox, which in and of itself has its very own uses. And it was going to require every ounce of firepower it had if it and its following infantry was supposed to crack open Fort 585. At dawn 077823 millennia 41, the opening bombardment of the battle began. Once it was over, the various infantry formations began their journey across no man's land, with mixed results. Initially, the 31st Company was making good progress towards their objective, but then their commanding officer and virtually his entire staff was murdered outright when a series of heavy weapons bunkers opened fire from their left flank. These were positions that had not previously been detected, and now the entire company was being suppressed by these positions. And beneath these very positions, even further on the left, the 65th Company was making very slow gains climbing the steepest parts of the ridge. In this area, the enemy could not fire directly into the 65th, but they were constantly being harassed by enemy mortar fire, and the terrain itself was making things extraordinarily difficult. It was a virtually sheer cliff face, which the company had to scale whilst carrying all of their equipment. They would not be able to knock out the bunkers suppressing the 31st Company anytime soon. Meanwhile, the 54th Company was making decent progress towards Fort C585. Unfortunately, they had already lost most of their armoured support. The Leman Russ tanks were finding it extraordinarily hard going, as the ground had already been chewed up by heavy artillery, and they were now being constantly targeted by the enemy's heavy artillery, guided in by spotters in the fort above, calling down pre-sighted artillery bombardments to strike at the Leman Russ tanks. This, along with the very hard-to-navigate terrain, meant that most of the Leman Russ tanks simply had to drive backwards and forwards in an attempt to avoid getting hit, whilst desperately searching for a clear way through all of the rubble and shell craters. The 2 Macarius heavy tanks fared at least a little bit better, the first getting within easy shelling distance of the fort when its tracks were blown off. For the rest of the battle, the massive behemoth simply just sat there, taking anything and everything the enemy could throw at it, whilst lobbing dozens of battle cannon shells and firing all of its heavy stubbers up at its tormentors in the fort above. Meanwhile, the 2nd Macarius was acting like a mobile strongpoint, driving up and down the line of advance for the Krieg infantry, providing cover, knocking out enemy emplacements, and generally making itself a big, fat nuisance. And it certainly appeared to be working. The enemy was under heavy pressure and began pulling back their forces from the forward trenches, which eventually was overrun by the 53rd Company, who gained the first line of trenches and began digging in, preparing themselves for the inevitable enemy counterattack. In a bid to improve their odds of holding on, the commander of the 468th ordered a battery of quad launchers to be rushed across no man's land to attempt to reinforce the company. Unfortunately, they were caught in an enemy salvo of heavy artillery fire. Most of their Centaur artillery carriers were either immobilized or destroyed, leaving the entire battery scattered and ineffective in the middle of no man's land and on the receiving end of a continuous barrage of artillery fire. This left the 53rd Company dangerously exposed, and with their own heavy artillery ordered to preserve ammunition at all costs, could only afford to send in a small supporting barrage to try and break up the massive human wave attack that was even now bearing down upon the 53rd Company. The Vraksian defenders were well aware of what it would mean to lose this position. Right now, the Death Korps of Krieg was stuck at the bottom of a gully. If they could keep them there, they could inflict heavy casualties upon them, and if the Death Korps was forced to retreat, even better. They would now have to advance over that gully once again in the face of murderous defensive fire. With fanatical zeal and egged on by the disciples of Zaphon, the Vraksian defenders threw themselves at the Krieg invaders in massed human wave-style assaults. The 53rd Company stood fast and fought desperately, hoping that the heavy weapons promised by their commanders would eventually arrive. They withstood several attacks from all sides, but eventually, slowly, and inevitably, they were overwhelmed. First, the heavy weapons they had brought along ran out of ammunition. Then, their Lucius pattern lasguns began running dry. After that, they were fighting the Vraksian defenders with bayonets, shovels, and hand grenades. The forward trenches were turned into a charnel house of slaughter, blood running in literal rivers down the permacrete trenches. Somewhere, someone issued a retreat order which barely saved what little remained of the 53rd Company from complete annihilation. The first wave assault, despite making it into the enemy's trenches, had failed. Meanwhile, back in the Krieg trenches, the two next companies were getting into position and ready to go over the top. They were in the middle of being issued extra ammunition and specialized equipment when an urgent call from Captain Fodor, the commander of the 54th Company, came in. He urged the commanders of the 468th to send in the next two companies immediately. The heavy Macarius tank that had so brilliantly been running interference for his company had recently been knocked out, but its efforts had not been in vain. Due to its noble sacrifice and the firepower of the second heavy Macarius tank, a hole had been blasted in Fort C-585, and Captain Fodor and a small number of his men had managed to enter the fort. They were even now holding on to this small sliver of a breach, and if he could receive urgent reinforcements immediately, he reckoned he could capture the fort. It was time for one of the Death Korps' oldest, truest and most favoured of tactics, a massed bayonet charge across no man's land, and the timing could not have been better. The skies above Vraks were darkening, heralding one of Vraks' torrential downpours. Charging across no man's land with the cover of the heavy rainstorm might just mean that the two regiments could make it. It was, however, a risk, and a fairly significant one at that. If the two regiments were sent in now, not fully prepared, and the promised breakthrough did not materialize, that would be it. The regiment's reserves would be exhausted, and the attack would officially have completely and utterly stalled. But what is life without a little bit of spice, after all? And besides, risky and improvised plans seem to have become a bit of a fad in the Death Korps on Vraks as of late, and so both reinforcement regiments were ordered to leg it across no man's land, to never stop, and of course, to fix bayonets. Showing no hesitation, despite their somewhat under-equipped state, the two regiments went across the top and began running across no man's land. Shielded in part from enemy supervision by the heavy rainstorm, they only had to contend with suppressing barrages of heavy weapons fire and the continuous barrage of heavy artillery shells blanketing no man's land. Soon they made it to the rearward elements of the 54th Company, and ran right past them. Seeing this incredible display of bravery on behalf of their comrades, the 54th Company also got to its feet and ran screaming towards Fort C-585. The wave of Death Corps guardsmen overran the enemy's defences, leaping into their trenches sword bayonets first, and began butchering the Vraksian defenders. Joining in the frenzied charge, Captain Fodor ran with his men, issuing orders that every dugout, every trench line, every room, and every corner was to be grenaded. Twice, for good measure, and then charged with lowered bayonets. In this fashion, the outer reaches of Fort C-585 was quickly taken. After this, specialized equipment in the form of flamethrowers and plasma guns were brought up to breach the internal bulkheads and then cleanse the compartments with fire. Alongside these special weapons also came a formation of Death Corps engineers, whose shotguns and blasting charges made short work of the remaining defenders of the Vraksian fort. After only a little while longer, the 54th Company had fully captured the fortress, and due to the combat engineers who had stopped just long enough to remobilize the immobilized Vicarious heavy tank who had now trundled up alongside the fort, it looked like they just might have the strength to hold it as well. Once again, an enemy fortress would turn out to be the chink in the Vraksian armour. From their new safe and fortified position, the 54th Company could feed yet further reinforcements into the enemy's trenches, whilst remaining virtually impervious to the enemy's bombardment. And once the Death Corps was fighting in good old-fashioned trenched battles against the Vraksians, they would have every advantage. But unfortunately, Captain Fodor would not be able to savour his victory for long. The skies had darkened, and the torrential rainpour which had so recently aided the Death Corps of Krieg was not quite of the nature of which they were used to. Sudden torrential downpours were nothing new on Vraks. It was one of the many features that made the planet such an uncomfortable place for the Death Corps and the defenders alike. But this downpour was not caused by the usual weather patterns. Oh no. This downpour was caused by a Chaos battleship moving into low orbit above the battlefield. And shortly thereafter, the Anarchy's Heart Despoiler-class battleship began firing its bombardment cannons onto the 468th Regiment. If Captain Fodor had known of this old saying from ancient terror, I am sure he would have been reciting it even now. It never rains, but it pours.